Webinar, everybody. I'm going to be your host. My name is Russel Horwitz, and I'm one of the two principals at Kwela, and I'm going to be talking to you about 360 feedback. So I've been using this tool for probably all 14 years of my career in management consulting, and I'm here to really just tell you about the pitfalls, the pros, the cons, but mostly the pitfalls and how to avoid them when using a tool like this. I have one request of all of you, and that is to, if at all possible, try and participate by asking questions. There's a chat screen that you can enter things in, and I've got a screen coming up where I'm going to ask you for your questions because I need to know what everyone's got in their mind and what you're looking for, and I'll make sure I speak to that to the greatest extent possible. So, without any further ado, let's jump in. So, what is 360 feedback? I suspect if you joined this webinar, you already know this, but really it's feedback that comes from all around, which includes one's boss, one's peers, one's direct reports. Also included typically is a self-score, so you can compare how you see yourself to how others see you. And sometimes you can have feedback from others as well. And what's important in 360 feedback is that typically you would categorize the feedback that you get from these different reviewer groups. You would categorize them and keep it together so that you can see which review group is saying what. Now, lots of research has been done into leadership development tools, and here's just the outcome of some of that research. This was done some time ago by Linkage Incorporated. Thousands of people interviewed. This is mostly human resource people, asking what was the most impactful part of a leadership development program or strategy, and 360 feedback rates right near the top. There is no, as far as I can tell, there is no alternative to something like 360 feedback when it comes to developing self-awareness. There are tons of self-assessments out there and personality assessments, which I've used myself, and I use them quite regularly with groups, but 360 feedback will tell you what you don't already know, and that's different, and it may confirm what you already know. So people learn about their blind spots, not just things that they might be doing that are negative, but also things that they are doing that are positive, how people view them positively. Often people don't realize that stuff until they see it in a 360 report. And now, let's move on to my real question of you. Assuming that your goal is some type of leadership development or performance management, something like that with 360, I need to get your questions. So here are 3 questions on my slide. What problems have you seen? And I'm sure you have seen some. Or what do you anticipate? But the big question is, what questions do you have? And if you wouldn't mind just typing something in the chat. No question is too small. It'll really, really help this session if I got a few questions from you. So I'm just going to give it a moment here and see what comes up. Okay, no, nothing yet. I know it takes people some time to type questions. Okay, so Heather writes, feedback from people who have different levels of interaction, example, daily versus quarterly. I think, okay, let me just make a note of that. You know what, I don't need a note of that because I've got it here on my screen. I've got another question here. What platforms do you recommend to help with the administrative burden? Yes. How do you address people who are reluctant from participating in a 360 program? People closer to retirement, no intention of changing. Tight teams, friends, colleagues, maybe bias. You know what, I'm going to answer all 4 of those, I think, in context when I get to that point, and I'll be sure to scroll back and look at these. I think that's the best way to go. Okay, so, and you can keep asking as we go. Let me go into the beginning then. This over here is what I consider to be some of the best practices of giving 360 feedback. And there's 12 things. 12 sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. And it's like a chain. The chain is going to be as strong as the weakest link. So you pretty much have to get each of these links correct for this process to work. So I'm going to be talking about each of these. And the first one on the list there, which is ensure that the organization is ready. And this is where I can address some of the questions that came up. These are the two things that you've got to look out for. I would say it is normal in organizations that there's some people who don't get along with other people, or there's low trust here and there. But if the atmosphere is completely poisonous and, you know, it's getting to the point of dismissals and court cases and things like that, the organization is probably not ready for 360. You probably need to be doing some other intervention, sometimes to get somebody out of the organization or something like that. But I wouldn't say it's not a good net to catch someone who shouldn't be in the organization. It's something to be used, I would say, in a normal organization with normal issues. And then the other one has to do with people's ability to rate each other. And Heather, I think this goes back to your question. So the reason I say recent reorganization is that you pretty much need to work with someone for quite a few months to be able to rate them on a 360. So if there's been a recent reorganization and everybody's got new managers and new teams, I would just give it some time, 3 to 6 months before trying a 360. Now, when one chooses reviewers for 360, this gets into Heather's question, you may find that some of those reviewers are not able to observe all of the behaviors. So what one needs to do in the 360 is just have a possible answer on each question that says, I'm not able to observe this. Like a don't know answer. You have to have that. You can't force people to answer all the questions because not everybody will be able to observe the 360 person being reviewed on every competency. So that's how one deals with it. You choose people who work with you, but don't expect that all of them will be able to view every competency. Hope that answers your question. I just want to see if there's any other questions in that vein. That one I'll get. The one about friends and colleagues. Now I'm going to get to that when we get to reviewer selection. Most of the questions I'm going to answer later. So I'm going to move along then. Next one over here is making the purpose clear. So this is something that everybody needs to know up front because it affects who you share the reports with. So a pitfall in 360 is that everybody thinks the reports are going to be confidential, and then somewhere along the line the CEO decides, you know what, I want to see all those reports, and then they get shared. And that's a problem. You want to avoid that. It can cause a lot of mistrust and ill feelings. So that stems from why are we doing this? So the three categories that I've got there, if you think about them, self-development, often leadership development would fall into that self-development category, i.e. we're doing this for you. It's for you to take away what you can and develop yourself as a leader. So that's by far the greatest use of 360 would fall into that very first category. Sometimes it's used in performance evaluation. I've seen this done at all levels, and sometimes when you've got like a executive team that is being evaluated by a board, or an executive director that's been evaluated by a board, that's when one commonly does 360s in a performance evaluation context. Sometimes it can be done at all levels of organizations. And then finally, succession planning, which is also a way of measuring people and so that others can know about it and make decisions based on it. Okay. Then one of the other best practices that I spoke about earlier, well, I didn't speak about it, but it's on the list, is starting at the top. So if you have a larger organization and you're going to do a few rounds of this, the important thing is don't begin at the bottom with managers, team leads, middle management. In other words, you've got to begin at the top. And the role modeling that you see is going to help get people on board. keep in mind that when you do a 360 assessment, for example, on an executive team, the directors are all going to be involved because they'll be asked to give feedback as direct reports. And it gets them, it gets their head around the tool as well. So when it's their turn, they're more ready for it, particularly if the executive have responded well to it. So just another tip. I don't think I need to harp on that one. Let me go back a bit here. Now, it just occurs to me that if I don't answer the questions now, I'm not going to be able to watch the new ones coming in so well. So let me just have a look over here. No, the platforms I'm definitely coming to. How do you address people who are reluctant from participating in a 360 program? So let me go with that one quickly over here. You know, people who are reluctant, people who have no intention of changing are not going to change. That would be my primary answer. I wouldn't expect that with a 360 or other program or any kind of leadership development initiative, someone who is really marking time because they're 2 years away from retirement, they have no intention of changing, they're probably not going to change. So I would try and avoid putting people like that into a leadership program, including something like a 360 feedback assessment. If, on the other hand, if it's going to be organization-wide or team-wide, then of course you would put them in. You wouldn't want to single them out and say, sorry, you're not going to improve, so we won't put you in. But if you're choosing people to be in any kind of program, I wouldn't choose people that don't have the potential to change. That would be my answer to that one. And I just want to see over here. Okay, there's some other ones about reports, which I'll come to. Okay. The next piece over here has to do with use of the tool. And one of you asked about the administrative burden of 360 feedback. And this is where you have a choice that is greatly going to affect your administrative burden. Well, firstly, let me address the most obvious question, which is, do we do this with an online assessment or on paper? I would definitely advocate against the use of paper for doing 360s. And by paper, I mean emails as well. Anything where there is a paper trail or an email trail back to the person who wrote something. Not only that, well, just speaking of my last comment, obviously that's going to make things not be anonymous, which is a problem, because anonymity is extremely important to 360 feedback. That's what allows people to be candid. And the other issue is that someone's going to be collecting all this information who then has to collate it. And they're going to collate it subjectively, in which case you don't have an objective report anymore. And it's going to take them an enormous amount of time. So I really just would not use paper. Now, if you're going to go with online, once again, you have two choices. And that is about the questionnaire. Do we use a standardized questionnaire or a customizable questionnaire? So what I mean by this, a standard questionnaire means some third-party organization has said, here's a 360 questionnaire. It's got these questions. The report looks like this. Here is our guide on how to deal with your report. Here's our process. It's all laid out. But guess what? If you've got organizational competencies that you want to question people on, that can't be used because it's standardized. Custom tools allow you to put in any questionnaire you want, so you can align it with your organizational competencies to a greater extent. It's a very different way of going about it. And I just want to contrast these two quickly along 5 variables. And you can see them over there. First variable over here, I've already alluded to, which is alignment to organizational competencies. So obviously the custom one is the one that does it. The second question is super important because an easy survey to administer is not always an easy survey to understand when you get your report. One of the first things you have to be able to answer for participants is how good is good enough. Now, if you're talking just a standard Likert scale, 10 points, and someone scores 5 out of 10, well, it's pretty obvious that they're scoring low. Or if they score 8.5 out of 10, it's pretty obvious that that's high. But what about 7 out of 10? Is that good? Is that bad? Or is that somewhere in the middle? It's hard to say. So one of the problems with 360s has to do with just being able to explain to people how good is good enough. Now, there's different approaches that are in use, and I just want to contrast those quickly. With standardized surveys, the two approaches that I've seen for answering that question, the first one is normative data. So what is done, this only works if you've got multiple people in the organization getting a 360 at the same time. For any score, it will say something like, you scored 7.5 is your average, and if you look at everybody else's scores, the average was 7, so you're somewhat above average, or everybody else's average was an 8. That helps. It certainly helps. The pitfall of that is that you've got different reviewers scoring different people, and everybody's got their own rater bias. So just because you're scoring lower than the group doesn't mean you actually are lower than the group. You just might have raters that are more biased to giving low scores. So it's not a perfect method, but it does help. And the other method is benchmarking against similar industries. So let's say you're in banking. We say, here's what the banking sector scores and how you score against it. I find that wholly unworkable, to tell you the truth, because organizational cultures are so different. What works in one bank isn't the same as what works in another, and you can apply that to any form of industry. So I'm not biased towards the second method. With customized surveys, sometimes the answer is no. So if you use SurveyMonkey, it absolutely can't help you with this. But if you use a purpose-built 360 tool that happens to have a dual rating scale, then I would say that's excellent, and that's what I actually recommend. Dual rating scale means that if I'm answering somebody's 360 and a behavior is listed, it will basically ask, to what extent does the person do this behavior? And given their role, to what extent should they be doing this behavior? And then it gives me a gap score. So it's asking every reviewer to individually benchmark the person they are reviewing. And you get very easy to understand data with that, and it totally answers the basic question of how good is good enough. Okay. The third piece is what kind of planning guides are provided with the 360. So generally the standard ones all have some type of process that goes behind it. Whereas with customized surveys, you pretty much have to build that each time. So I would say it's survey dependent. Costs, I wouldn't take these costs to the bank, excuse the pun. But generally you're going to find that for customized surveys, the cost is a little bit lower actually. And the reason is you're not paying for somebody's intellectual property of an actual survey questionnaire and all of the development guides and things like that that follow the 360. So it's usually a little bit less expensive. If you use basic online survey tools like SurveyMonkey, it's obviously much less, but that has downsides, and I'll come to that. And the final one is, do I have to be certified to use the survey? Well, some of the standardized ones, yes. The custom ones, never, because they tend to be just a list of behaviors, and anyone can understand the feedback. So just in terms of some example tools, here is a list of standardized ones and customized ones. The ones in orange are the ones we happen to use. I'm not saying that they are the best, but the 2020 Insights Gold I really, really like, and I've used it. It must be hundreds of times by now, and it does the job. It's like a real workhorse type of program. So some of the criteria in choosing one of these tools are things like this, the dual rating scale, which I've spoken about. And by the way, I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Also, how the reports is sorted. So a purpose-built 360 feedback report will do things like sorting all of the outcomes, all of the behavioral outcomes from highest to lowest scoring, things like that, which make it easy to spot where am I doing well, where do I need to do better. The ability to report aggregates of a group of people, things like that. But possibly the most important one, and this has to do with the administrative burden that somebody asked about earlier on, is to make sure that you've got a tool that gives you a project, the ability to run multiple people in a project. So this is just a screen capture of 2020 Insights Gold over here. It doesn't show you a lot on the screen capture, I realize, but this tool will give you a project ability. So let me be specific. If I've got 20 people that are all getting a 360 report done, I can enter them as a single project, and I can kick off that 360 with a single mouse click. If I need to send a reminder to all responders who have not yet responded, it's a single mouse click. If I were to do exactly the same thing in a tool not purpose-built for 360s, let's take something like a SurveyMonkey or one of those, then for each person being reviewed, each of their reviewer groups is going to have what's called a collector. So if you've got 3 reviewer groups for each person, that's 3 collectors, and if you've got 20 people, that's 60 collectors. If I want to send everybody who hasn't responded a message to say, please respond by Friday, I have to click individually into 60 collectors and send people a message. And that's going to take me hours, not to mention a lot of frustration. So that's how I would answer the question. You pretty much need a purpose-built 360 tool that has a project, the ability to run multiple people as a single project. Kelly, I hope that helps with your question. Okay, moving along, we get to the next piece, which is the questionnaire itself. So this is where I see a lot of pitfalls. So just to give you a question over here, let's see if you can answer this. Please rate on a scale of 1 to 10 the following behaviors, and I've listed 2 questions over there. Understands the big picture and develops innovative approaches to business problems and maintains the highest possible work standards. If I put those 2 questions on a 360 questionnaire and I ask people to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, can anyone see what is wrong with that? Just type it in the chat box if you wouldn't mind. I'm just going to give it a minute. Both of those are going to generate really bad feedback. The lowest score is a 1, the highest score is a 10. Oh, but Kelly, now I see your answer. What is the lowest possible? Yeah, you're on to it. So if you look at those questions, the problem with the first one is that it's what we call double-barreled. Understanding the big picture and developing innovative approaches to business problems, you're asking 2 different things in the same question. So if you get a high score, you don't know that you've scored high on both, or a low score, you don't know if you've scored low on both, or an intermediate score, you still don't know. It's going to confuse the reviewer is what's going to happen. And by extension, it's going to confuse the person being reviewed when they get their report. The second one, the problem with that is that it's biased. So the word highest makes that an illegal question. You want to have neutrally worded questions that can be rated on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is highest and 1 is lowest. But you don't want to put the highest word into the question. So here are a whole list of problems that we see in survey design. Let me run through these quickly. Competencies, yes, Gary, you got it right. Vague, that too. Here are some things that we've got to watch out for. Sometimes you'll see competencies like leadership or communication. Those are very, very broad because leadership in itself is a whole list of competencies. And communication is also a whole list of competencies because there's conflict resolution, there's influencing others, there's communicating with staff. Those are all 3 different competencies right there, and they're all communication. So when you have a very broad competency like communication, again, if you score high on communication, you don't know what it is you're doing well at because the competency is too broad. And it can be argued that communication overlaps with leadership, in which case, which one is being scored? So I would try and avoid that by going with more specific competencies that are narrower, actually, which leads to the second problem, where the competency model is too narrow. Now, this usually starts when you have an organization that has organizational competencies, and it's just a set of maybe 3 or 4 competencies that, you know what, everybody's got to be good at this in this organization. It's important to align a 360 survey to those competencies, but I wouldn't just use those competencies for a 360 because you're going to find it's narrow. Let me explain it a different way. No matter what organization you run a 360 in, you're going to have people who find that they need to work on things like managing people and communicating with people that they're managing. You're going to find people that have to work on time management behaviors, right up to CEO level. You're going to find people that have to work on things like strategic thinking and strategic planning. Irrespective of what the organizational competencies are, and one needs to ask about all those things because all of these different competencies have tentacles that affect each other. Being able to work on strategy requires you to also be able to manage your time so that you're not in the moment all the time. So a broad competency model is what we suggest. Here's another one, not categorizing the questions properly. And I'll show you an example of that later on. So typically you have competencies, and for each competency you have a number of questions. But if those questions don't perfectly align to the competency that they're falling under, then when you look at your competency summary on your reports, it's invalid because there have been questions in that competency that are actually not part of that competency. So this is an exercise in logic, and I'll talk about it again later on. Of course, the length of the survey is another one because tired people don't give good feedback. I'll come back to this one in a minute. I've spoken about double-barreled or confusing questions. Biased questions I've also mentioned. And the other one is asking about behaviors that people can't see. People aren't going to be able to respond. It's important that every single thing you ask about in a 360 is observable. So going back to the competencies, this just happens to be the competency model that we use. I'm not saying it's the one you have to use, but what we've tried to do here is essentially ask ourselves, a good leader is good at what? And what are all those competencies? And these 9 seem to capture all of it. So we've got the directional things like critical thinking, strategic planning. We've got the sideways items like influencing and teamwork. We've got the personal things like time management, the communication things like communication, conflict resolution, how to manage people, the ability to even receive feedback and deal with mistakes, one's own mistakes, which I call personal growth, and the focus on the customer is the final one. So we begin with something like this, and we design a few questions that fall under each of those, basically. Hopefully that makes sense. Then, I'm just clicking on a few things here. The next issue is the length of the survey. So here are some guidelines. Up to 30 questions, I don't think you're going to have a problem getting people to answer the survey. 30 to 40, I would say, is okay. 40 is not as good as 30, but when you get more than 40, I would expect to have rapidly diminishing returns. I have seen 360 surveys of 60 questions, and imagine you are a CEO and you're being asked to complete a survey for all 6 of your vice presidents, and each one has 60 questions. You've just been asked to complete 360 questions that you have to think about, and it's going to drive people mad. By the time they get to the 3rd, 4th one, either they just won't do it, or they will do it flippantly without thinking. So less is more. Rather ask about less. Keep it short. And the other part of this is what takes people a long time is the open-ended questions, having to type in something, not just answer a number. We always just have 2. The one is, what does this person do best? And the other one is, what do you think this person can do differently? And you ask that at the end of the survey, once people have had a chance to think of all the competencies, and they will synthesize something and write it down. And that's actually all you need. So moving along here, by the way, please do ask questions as we go. Moving along is another point over here that I wanted to show you, the bias. Actually, I've dealt with this already, but let's just look at what the solution should look like. Please rate the extent to which he or she makes excellent decisions. So how would you fix something like this? It's not, I'll give you a clue, you can't just take out the word excellent. you want to ask about someone's decision making and they're going to be rated on a scale of 1 to 10, then what should the question be? Any ideas? Okay, I'm going to give you the answer, something like this. It's not the only possible answer. Please rate the quality of his or her decision making. And that you can rate on a scale of 1 to 10. The other one I spoke to you about earlier is categorization. So here's an example of it actually done right. This is a competency called strategic thinking. And if you look at those 3 items underneath it, you can see that they're all aligned to strategic thinking. And that's what's important. You can't have a question in there that's not pure strategic thinking, because it will invalidate that part of the report which shows how the person scored on this competency. Hopefully that makes sense. Then, just getting into the rating scale, I've alluded to this a few times, but this is just an example of the rating scale that we advocate. And you can see the 2 questions there. To what extent does the person exhibit this behavior? And given their role, to what extent should that person exhibit this behavior? And I think I've got a picture over here of what the report might look like. So this is actually the reporting that comes out of the tool 2020 Insights. So what you're looking at here is the response to a single behavior, which encourages team members to think and solve problems for themselves. And you'll notice, let's just look at the numbers on the right. You know what, I've got a little pen here that I can use, I believe. Pen. So this column right here, see my arrow, that's the extent score. That's to what extent this person is doing this behavior right now. The next column right there is to what extent should they be doing this behavior, and then it gives you the difference. And you can see the different reviewer groups there as well. So self, manager, and direct reports are the 4 reviewer groups, and then there's an average which doesn't include the self. So you can't give yourself a high self score and hope to affect your average. And the graph that you're looking at there is just a visual representation of the extent, importance, and gap score. A longer arrow pointing to the right means a larger gap, a larger negative gap. Pointing to the left means a positive gap. And if you look at all these little numbers appearing in here, those are a histogram of where the extent scores are falling. So this shows that 3 people have scored this person 5 or 6, and another 6 people have scored them 8, 9, 10, 3, 2, and 1 respectively. So it gives you a sense of how the wider group is scoring me, if people by and large agree, or if I've got some outliers. In this case, I've got 6 fans and 3 detractors. So that's just another example of the gap analysis method. So coming along then to the next piece, which is to ensure confidentiality. And I'm just looking if there's any questions here now. So the confidentiality piece, as I alluded to earlier, depends on what the 360 is being used for. So in the most common use of 360s, which is probably leadership development, which is self-development, generally only participants would have a look at their own report. If there was a third-party coach involved or something like that, that person would probably have access as well. But within an organization, generally, your report's confidential to you. If people's managers are going to get it, it's not necessarily a bad idea, but they have to know up front. If you're doing something like performance evaluation, then definitely the manager and probably human resources as well are going to have access to the reports. And in the event that it's succession planning, well, then there's usually some type of committee, which could be the executive team or a smaller group that actually looks at successes, and they're going to have access to the report. But no matter which way you do it, people being reviewed need to know that how the reports are being shared, if at all. And it's very dangerous to change it at midway through the survey. Moving along then, I want to talk about reviewer choice. And this again depends on the use of the survey. So in leadership development or self-development, I find it's best to have participants choose their own reviewers. So somebody asked me earlier on, where was it? Somebody asked about how to get participants excited about this. One of the ways you do that is to ensure to them that their reports are confidential. This is for them. They're going to learn what's out there anyway, and there's no downsides to it. There's no implications. Nobody's seeing the report. And you're going to choose your own reviewers as well, by the way, the people you want to hear from. We find that if you give people guidelines and you say, look, choose a combination of fans and detractors, you need to learn, people by and large do. And generally people get the feedback they need, just with that one direction. If it's any kind of performance assessment or succession planning for that matter, then others need to have say on the reviewer list. And that's why you see those two bullets on the right, where the manager augments the list that comes from the participants. Sometimes HR or the manager actually provides the list in the first place. You can do that as well. This is a good time to talk about eliminating destructive feedback. And I got a question about that earlier on. So one of the risks of 360 is that somebody who doesn't have a lot of skill in giving feedback writes something really, really untoward and hurtful and not helpful on a 360. And somebody important gets this feedback and they hurt and their nose is out of joint and the wheels come off. You do need to try and mitigate that. And there are two ways to do it. The first one, and actually I don't have this on my slides, but the first one is that anybody that's chosen as a reviewer, what we always do is we send them a briefing which shows them how to give feedback, how to give constructive feedback, and specifically things not to say. Like you can't say things like, so-and-so is a bully, because it's judgmental. What you can say is, so-and-so raises her voice in everyday situations, and it makes us feel this way, because that's observable. So it's not about holding back. It's about saying things that are constructive and observable. So we teach people how to do this, and that will help get better feedback. But the next part of it is that it's a good idea to have some neutral person or third party have a look at all the reports and read the comments. And just look for comments that are destructive but not constructive, and eliminate or even modify them. Usually we would eliminate them. So here are some examples of, I would say, difficult feedback. Now, if you look at those four, you might ask, well, how would one change those? Now, let me just go through this real quickly. When I see feedback like this in a report, Susan is an obviously unhappy or bitter person. The question I ask myself, is this going to help Susan improve? And the answer is no. So it's not a great comment. And probably it needs to be deleted or changed. Or she has a glass half empty attitude, same thing. And by the way, I've seen all of these comments on actual reports. These are, I didn't make these up. He is somewhat arrogant and a know-it-all, very judgmental. But if you look at the fourth comment, John has a bad habit of giving people hell in public. This is why he has lost respect. That's difficult to take, but it's actually observable. And it's probably going to help John. He needs to know this. I would leave that comment in. So there would be my actions on what to do with those comments when highlighted in a 360 report. If anyone disagrees, let me know. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that answers some of your question on how to avoid, very negative feedback. Somebody asked another question, which is, I'm just looking over here, which is how to understand a report that has polarized feedback. I think the answer to this is part of how you debrief 360s with people. When I debrief a 360 with people, I say to them, don't expect to get consistent feedback. You've got different reviewer groups, and each one has different people, and they all experience you differently. Some are going to score you high, some are going to score you low. And that's all there is. You need to try and understand it as it is. If you've got two outliers, if 6 people think you're doing great and 2 don't, Ask yourself why. What are you doing that's leading to that outcome? Don't say, oh, the two don't matter. So polarized feedback is actually part of what you normally get in a 360. And I would answer the same thing when we say, what about tight teams or friends and colleagues that may be biased? So when people like each other, they may score each other somewhat higher, but if you look at how one needs to interpret 360 feedback, you can still look at what are the high points and what are the low points. And the low points are probably developmental areas, and the high points are probably strengths. So that's part of the process of how one debriefs a 360. Everybody's feedback individually is going to be subjective, and you've got to realize that when you show people how to interpret their reports. That's how I would answer it. Hopefully that helps. I've spoken about sorting of reports, but ideally a tool would sort reports something like this. Which competencies score the highest? Which competencies score the lowest? Then the individual questions, which are the highest, which are the lowest? Top 5, bottom 5. And then I would group all the written comments in the same area so it's easy to understand them at the same time. You don't want to be paging through 15 pages looking for a few comments here and a few comments there. It just makes it very difficult to understand a report. Now, a few times I've alluded to interpreting a 360. And this is a non-trivial thing. So one of the pitfalls that I see with 360s, and you'll find this in various organizations, somebody's had a 360, the report was emailed to them or so-called thrown over the wall. They said, well, here's your report. No support, no guidance. People look at their report, and human nature, when people get a report, they're going to open it up, they're going to scroll through it, and they're going to look for the dirt, right? And when they find the dirt, they're going to say, oh, I think I know who wrote that. And then they think they're done. So the human nature is something you've got to be dealing with all the time. So what that looks like, and actually this is part of the next bullet as well, helping people with action plans, is you've got to put people through a process. It could be a one-on-one process, or it could be a workshop if you're dealing with a group. But generally what I would do is firstly give them time to look at the report. At least an hour, but ideally a day. Not so long that they get to stew in it forever, but long enough that they've internalized it. B, have them list all the things which they are doing well. And we're looking for a big list. There's usually 10 or 20 things that people are doing well that you can spot in a 360. Secondly, have them list anything that they're not doing so well at, or where they are getting negative feedback. Thirdly, look for how these things might be playing together. So for example, I alluded to earlier, somebody who has time management challenges might also not be focusing strategically. Somebody who everybody likes might also not be advocating for things, might just be saying yes to everything or keeping quiet. So you try and look for links, and you try and help people understand their work style and their work pattern. And based on that, we ask them to synthesize a theme. So this is how I'm working. I'm very strategic, but I'm not so good at actually operationalizing things. It's a theme, if you know what I mean. And based on that, come up with a development goal. 1 or 2 things maximum. Another pitfall is to look at everything I scored low on a 360, all 20 of those questions, and call that my development goal. But an adult will not work on 20 things at the same time. They'll work on 1 or 2, and even that will be a lot of effort. So you try and find the main development goal for that person. And from there, what one does is develops action plans. So again, people have to be coached on how to develop an action plan. And that's individual actions that I'm going to do between now and a certain time frame to move towards my development goal. And that process may even have multiple steps in it. So let me just show you some examples of what I've just been talking about. This over here is I'd say, truncated version of an actual 360 interpretation. Truncated because I've only listed 3 or 4 points on each one. but for the purposes of a slide, I didn't want to have something busy. So you can see where this person's scoring high and where they're scoring low. This is an actual 360 that I'm referring to over here. Now, it's quite clear in this case that this person's, tactical focus, very in the moment, they're probably very responsive. You send them an email, they'll send you one back. Very good at day-to-day is probably one of the reasons they are not being all that strategic. Things like that. And what this leads to is probably more that you can see over here. Possible development goal over here might be things like time management, delegating. If this is a leader, I believe this was a senior manager. So delegate more, manage time better, and spend more time working strategically, focusing on the long term. That was this person's development goal. Now, that should be determined not by a coach or someone like that, but in consultation with the person actually being reviewed. It's ultimately their choice, what they choose to work at. That's just to give you a little example. Moving along, there's another concept with where you go out of this. Oh, by the way, this is just a little example of an actual action plan. This is somebody's action plan. And it had to do with assertiveness and workload management. Let me show you, go to bullets number 10 and 12 now, which was ensuring that participants involve others. So this is really a leadership development concept. It's a contact sport. And there's good reasons for this. Let me explain to you what I mean. If somebody says, okay, I'm going to work on my ability to listen. I've just realized through my C360, I'm not perceived as a listener. I'm going to become a good listener. If I don't tell anyone about that, guaranteed no one's going to notice. I might be sitting there in a meeting, listening really hard, maybe even paraphrasing somebody. But if they don't believe I'm a listener, they may not notice that. But the one time where I don't agree with someone, and I say, no, things are going to be different, they'll say, oh, there he goes again. You see, he's not listening. And because of this, views of people tend to self-reinforce, because you always spot things in them that correspond to your worldview that you already have of them, and you don't notice the efforts to change. So the person who's just had a 360, the onus is really on them to go back to their reviewers and say, well, thanks a lot for the feedback. I've learned the following things. Here's what I'm going to be trying to do differently. I want your feedback on that over time. I'm going to be asking you about this. I'm going to be asking how I'm doing. If people do that, you're going to find that they are perceived to have improved. And that's the important thing. So this is another one of the links in the chain that has to be there. We often use this process in leadership development called a mini survey, which is not a 360. What it is, when someone decides on a development goal, we ask them to nominate the behaviors they're going to be working on and a set of people that are going to act as their observers and rate them X months from now on how they did. So this is an example of someone who chose 2 behaviors, which you can see there, the 2 lowest, builds a shared vision and shows genuine interest when another person is speaking. And we ask those reviewers, how would you say this person was on this behavior, and how would you say they are now? And they get a before and after score that you're seeing on the right. It's still using the 2020 Insights tool, as a matter of fact. This measurement will help people improve, because what gets measured gets done. They know they're going to get measured. They tend to do these behaviors. And it also helps motivate them to involve those other people. Now, if you took the averages of how people score on surveys like this and the extent to which they actually involved other people, the contact sport notion, and you plotted a correlation between those two, we invariably get a graph like this. Now, each of those orange dots is a human being who participated in a leadership program, which began with a 360. And the horizontal axis is to what extent did they involve those other reviewers, The vertical axis is to what extent were they perceived to have improved. And you're seeing an Excel best fit line there. And generally, you're going to see that type of correlation between people involving others and being perceived to have improved. Now, that is what I wanted to show you about 360s today. Kwela, for that matter, can help in 3 areas on 360s. We can help design surveys. We can administer surveys that either you design or we design. And finally, we can help with interpreting 360s and coaching people. And that was the end of the theory bit that I wanted to show you today. I want to see if there are more questions. If you have any questions, please type them in. It will be very useful to others to see your questions. So I'm just going to wait a little bit and see what questions come up. No question is too small. I'm just going to hang on. Anybody typing? I'm not seeing the little pen thing, so I'm assuming there aren't a lot of questions. Then in that case, what I want to let you guys know is that everything that you've seen on my slides and more, I have captured in a white paper. And if you go to the Kwela website, at the lower right, you'll see a button that says Publications. And if you click that, you'll see a link to something that says 360 Best Practices. And it has all this information and more details. So feel free to go and download it. And thanks everybody for your attendance. You can also write to me with any questions that you've got. And we always put tips on our LinkedIn site and our blog, just so you know. All the best, guys. Have a very nice day.